Hello and welcome to our seminar, which we've called Persistent Symptoms Post-Infection and what's going on in the brain. I have to say, it is amazing to see so many people that I know, people that I've been talking to that I don't know, now spread over more than one page. And I have to say, these live conversations and the subsequent recordings I find just so powerful. We have people in the room that literally have been working on these conditions for decades. So we've got authors, we've got doctors, we've got researchers, we've got coaches, and we've got therapists, and we've got patients, and we've got people that are carers for patients, and we've also got people that are recovered as well. And the aim of all of us, I think, is to try and help people to recover. So my name's Rachel. I came into this world because I had long COVID and I recovered from long COVID. And I'm the co-chair of the consumer arm of COFFI. And I have to say, it is the most hideous illness that I can imagine, as well as fatigue, really debilitating fatigue. I counted and I had a myriad of over 20 symptoms. The most bothersome being, the one that really scared me was my purple toes. They were blistered, they were cold to the touch, they were really, really sore. And so what I want to know tonight is the mechanisms for these very real, very visible, very physical, and very painful symptoms that can follow post-infection. And I think if we can understand that, then we can attempt to find a way through for so many people. So COFFI is a group of international scientists who research post-infectious fatigue and share their resources and their data. And they've got lots and lots of published research that we can all, I think, learn from. And if you want to know more, then you can visit their website. The consumer arm really is the people with lived experience. And our job is to ask questions of the scientists and try and understand and make the research more meaningful for consumers. So I'm joined by four wonderful colleagues, and I'm going to get them to introduce themselves. And I'm going to start with Julie. Julie, do you just want to introduce yourself to everyone?
Yeah, hi everyone. So my name's Julie. I am 46 and I live in northeast Scotland. I got COVID in 2022, in the summer of 2022, and it was almost immediately followed by long COVID. There wasn't really a gap where I felt well. I know some people do have that, but I didn't really have that. It was, like Rachel already said, it was the most awful thing I can ever imagine. And I am fairly confident that that is the worst thing I will ever go through in my life, now that I've been through that. And also I am now fully recovered and living quite an active life and loving life. And I'm sure you'll hear more about that later.
A little while in terms of exactly what that was like. Vanessa, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself as well?
Hey everyone, I'm Vanessa. I'm 32 years old. I live in Scotland as well, although I'm from Germany originally. I caught COVID in the end of 2020 before any vaccines were available. Similar to Julie, I didn't really have a gap in, it just immediately went into long COVID. However, I sort of have two folds to my story because I had a history of chronic fatigue syndrome following Epstein-Barr virus infection a couple of years prior.
Yeah, and I know that's really common actually, Vanessa, so we'll be finding out in a bit more detail why that might be. But first we're going to go to Maria, and I can't even see where she is on the page, but hopefully she can hear me. Maria, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Rachel. Hi, I'm Maria Pedersen. I'm a pediatrician and a researcher from Norway. So actually my PhD was on chronic fatigue following EBV infection, and my postdoctoral fellowship is on treatment of long COVID. So yeah, it's a known field. Yeah.
Brilliant. So lots and lots that we can learn there. And finally, we've got Anna Andersson.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Andreasson, and I'm a researcher at Stockholm University, and I'm specifically interested in persistent symptoms.
Thank you very much, Anna. I don't think I pronounced your surname right, sorry. So Julie, coming back to you, and I know we've heard just a little bit in terms of what happened to you, but do you want to spend maybe a minute or so just giving us a little bit more detail in terms of what was that like, you know, some of the worst symptoms perhaps, how debilitating, and maybe also anything in terms of diagnosis for you, Julie?
Yes, so in advance of this, I thought I'd better try and write down all the different symptoms that I had, just because, you know, I might have forgotten some now that I'm fully recovered. I stopped at about 23. I'm sure there's many more that I couldn't even remember. Yeah, I mean, some of them were just quite annoying, but not on their own particularly scary or terrible, but some of them were completely debilitating. So during the worst of it, I was completely bedridden for a couple of months or so in a quiet, dark room, couldn't read, couldn't cope with noise, stimulation, couldn't make it to the bathroom. I had a very restricted diet because I was reacting to a lot of food, you know, so that's kind of, that was definitely the worst. I was very lucky and managed to find a doctor who knew all the right things to ask, did all the right tests, and I got quite a few co-diagnoses, which is kind of part, you know, he described these all as fairly common parts of long COVID, but that included MCAS, and that explained the way I was reacting to lots of food. So I'd been following a low histamine diet because that was the only things I could eat without feeling like I'd been poisoned. He diagnosed me with POTS, so postural orthostatic intolerance, which I'm sure lots of people here are familiar with, and linked to that, more broadly, dysautonomia. And he explained how quite a lot of my symptoms could come under this kind of dysautonomia umbrella, which POTS is also part of that. And also, I have a family history of ME, and I know that there is a bit of a genetic predisposition as well. So I think that's probably worth mentioning, but I'd never had it before myself.
Thank you very much, Julie. And I remember meeting you when you were at your worst as well. So I'm so glad that you found a path to recovery. Vanessa, what was it like for you? Was it similar, or were there differences?
Yes, it was similar and it was not in one sense. So I caught glandular fever, which is caused by Epstein-Barr virus, back in 2016. And followed by that, I had sort of a mild case of chronic fatigue for the next 1.5 to 2 years. So it was annoying enough that I kept going to doctors, but not bad enough to keep me like out of university or out of work. I made what I termed back then spontaneous recovery for a couple of years. I know now why, but more to that later. But in 2020, when I caught COVID, it was almost like a switch had been flipped in my brain almost immediately. So similar to Julie, I counted my symptoms and I got to 48. So it was extremely debilitating. At my worst, I was completely bedridden, lying in a dark room, not eating, not sleeping, basically completely despondent. I was just not responding to anything. I didn't want to see anyone. Was very suicidal, completely disabled. I don't want to go too much into all of my symptoms, but I also had quite a few diagnoses. Chronic fatigue syndrome, POTS, MCAS. So I was down to 8 to 10 foods at my worst. So it was basically a chicken, rice, broccoli, and tahini diet for a long time. I had at my worst seizures. So I was then diagnosed with functional neurological disorder. And followed by that, I was diagnosed with something called DPDR. So that's derealization and dissociation syndrome. So I was almost feeling detached from reality. It was a very, very scary feeling.
Thank you, Vanessa. And Vanessa, Julie, I think it's incredibly brave to come on and to share your story, but also really useful for people that are still going through this. Anna, what's going on from an immunological point of view and a scientific point of view? What's going on?
So I will give you a crash course. So I will spend 10 minutes of something that usually takes me 10 hours teaching time and see if that helps shed some light on this. There we go. So we're going to talk about the stress response and also the sickness response. And first we need to separate stress into different components. It's easy to just talk about stress and just mean everything by it, but I would like us to separate it into stressors. And stressors, they are actual or anticipated threats to the organism, and that could be a bear, for example. Meeting a bear, thinking about meeting a bear, or actually meeting a bear. Doesn't matter. Both are stressors, and it doesn't need to be something as bad as running into a bear. It could be high noise, and it could be an infection. All of these things are stressors, and it's up to the brain to decide what is a stressor. And that means that we can imagine stressors, which is very stressful, or interpret situations very differently as stressors or not, depending on what we've been through in our lives before. And when the brain realizes that there is a threat, we will have a stress response. And the purpose of the stress response is to, I will just move you out of the way. The purpose of the stress response is to manage the threat and support recovery. And during the stress response, we have the support of two stress axes. We will have the sympathetic nervous system, which is part of the autonomic nervous system. This is what you would feel immediately when you're stressed. It's due to the release of noradrenaline and adrenaline, and this response is within seconds. And then we have a slower stress axis called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis. This will lead to the production of cortisol, and this is a much slower process. But both of these axes, they aim to mobilize energy and resources so that we can manage the stress, the threat that we're facing. And at the same time also inhibit those body functions that we don't need for the immediate survival. So looking closer at the autonomic nervous system, we have the sympathetic nervous system part here and the parasympathetic nervous system right here. They are part of the autonomic nervous system. They work a bit like a yin-yang, that they balance each other. The autonomic nervous system, consisting of these two parts, regulates bodily functions. And you can see all the organs here being innervated, both these nervous systems. This is something that is largely unconscious. So even though we can think about our heartbeat, we don't regulate the heartbeat consciously, at least not all the time. Breathing, same thing, that we don't need to think about breathing. We might be able to control our breathing, but we don't normally think about it. And then we have other things bodily processes that we don't think about, like digestion and the production of urine and sweating, for example. So what happens throughout the day is that we have a balance between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system we usually call the fight, flight, or freeze response, while the parasympathetic nervous system gives us the rest and digest response. But it's very important to recognize that these systems are in balance throughout the day, and we need the sympathetic nervous system just to get out of bed in the morning and just to function normally. So this is a balance going back and forth. What happens when the sympathetic nervous system is activated is that the heart rate goes up, the blood pressure goes up, respiration and perspiration goes up. You can see that the eyes becomes blacker because the pupils they contract so that you get more light into the eyes. We get more blood flow to muscles. The attention is increased. But we don't care about digestion and reproduction in this situation. And this is a very, very useful response if you manage to bump into a bear when you're out walking in Yosemite. So this is the immediate response that we get. We also get the activation of the HPA axis. And the HPA axis will release cortisol. Cortisol is a much slower acting hormone. It actually changes what genes are expressed in cells. And that means that cortisol will change the cell to the core, so what function the cell actually has. So much slower response that influence function over time, and this is vital also for recovery. You need to at this stage, when you have the highest amount of cortisol, is when you need to recover. So when you need to replenish the energy sources, for example. So important, talking about long COVID, is the inflammatory reflex. Because why are we talking about this? Yeah, so here we got the HPA axis, the release of cortisol, and the acetylcholine and adrenaline, noradrenaline that we talked about. And this is an immune cell. So the brain uses the stress axis to regulate the immune system. And the immune system use the sympathetic nervous system, or the parasympathetic nervous system, the nervous system to signal back to the brain what is actually happening in the body. So when we have an infection, the immune cells will release what we call pro-inflammatory cytokines that will signal to the brain. And when this happens, we will develop a range of symptoms that you probably will recognize. We will experience fatigue, increased sleep. We will feel depressed. We won't like to interact socially with other people. We feel anhedonia, and that means that we don't get pleasure out of things that normally pleasures us. Allodynia means that the body gets sore to the touch, so you don't feel pain, but when you touch your skin, you will feel pain. And also developing a fever or feeling cold. And this is a strategy that we have developed with evolution, because it means that we will keep ourselves safe when infected or when during threats. And it also will save energy, because the immune system takes a lot of energy, so we need it. So it's not just a weakness, this is actually a motivational state to survive, to increase survival. And what happens if things become out of the ordinary, like when you face that bear every day, or the equivalent of facing the bear, with the multiple activations of the stress axis will result in a toll on the system. Or in this case, this example here is when you don't adapt. So you keep activating the stress axis. And eventually you might get into a situation where you can't go back to normal anymore, or where you just can't mount an appropriate response to the threat you're facing, whatever it might be. And the thing is, when we get into a situation where the stress and the sickness response are not adaptive anymore, because they are all interlocked. So if some part gets downregulated and some part gets upregulated, it will all become out of sync. So this is some sort of schematic here of how all these systems are intertwined with the brain, the central nervous system, the cardiovascular system, the immune functions. So if it can become problematic, and then the general rules on how the physiology works doesn't apply anymore. So that was what I had to say.
Thank you very much, Anna. I don't know how to now stop your sharing.
I can
There
do
you go.
that.
Brilliant. Anna, I have to say, I mean, firstly, thank you. I know that was 10 hours and we asked you to do the impossible, and you did an amazing job putting it into 10 minutes. So thank you. That explanation was actually a slightly more detailed explanation than I got that literally was the explanation that set me on the path to recovery. So Anna, I wish I'd met you at the beginning of my journey. And it makes sense in terms of my toes, my purple toes, that from what you're saying, I wrote down a few notes that the sympathetic nervous system basically was activated. And so it set in a chain of kind of biochemical messengers that included cortisol and cytokines and histamine to produce this inflammatory response. But because I was in such sustained stress, it just carried on. I think that's what I'm taking from this lecture. And I love, and we've talked earlier about the context and how important that is between meeting the bear in Yosemite and meeting a bear in the zoo. And I think what happened with my toes was that it was in the middle of the pandemic, and I Googled, why have I got purple toes after COVID? And of course, what came back was these are COVID toes. And then the meaning that I put on those, whereas if I'd have, I actually had it a year ago after some psychological stress, exactly the same cold toes that were purple, but I put a different meaning on it. Anna, one question. You talked about cortisol influencing gene expression, and that creating changes at a cellular level. Would that include mitochondria? Because there's often a lot of talk in terms of mitochondria being changed in these conditions. Or could it?
Yes, it could. So cortisol will influence like most bodily processes that we have, and within the cell, there are studies showing that if you add cortisol to cells, the mitochondria will change. It's just hard to investigate that on like a whole person.
Yeah.
So hard to know what it means, and it probably depends on for how long the exposure is.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. And I'm going to I'm going to start with Julie, if that's all right. And just, Julie, what resonated with you in terms of what Anna said, and then we'll find out from Vanessa as well.
Yeah, I think there was a lot that resonated, and just hearing that all set out just makes sense of so much of sort of my illness and leading up to it, but then also how I recovered as well. So I think there's sort of two different bits to that. Before being ill, I just had a lot going on in my life. I'm not one of these people that generally always lives, 120% all guns blazing and doesn't know how to rest and relax. That's not who I am in general. But the couple of months leading up to being ill, there were so many things going on in my personal life and in my work life. It was just bad timing that they all came at the same time. So, linking back to what Anna was saying, by the time I became ill with COVID, I'd already had this kind of constant stress going on from different sources. And then I guess COVID, and I was quite ill with COVID, and I found that quite terrifying, actually, just how ill I was at the acute phase. And so that was just like this final stressor. And I guess my body just then stayed in this elevated state and was no longer able to kind of respond in a normal way. And that just makes a lot of sense now. And then I guess the other part of it is kind of part of the way that I recovered. There's kind of lots in there, but it was just understanding that what I don't want to be doing with the way that I was responding to everything and all these, horrendous thoughts and emotions that I was feeling, which obviously is completely natural because this is just so horrendous and, the most ill that I have ever been in my life. But these are things that I could actually have some control over. And so that's when things started to improve, when I recognized that I need to stop adding additional stress all the time just by the way that I was responding to things, and kind of start to allow my body to respond a little bit better.
Thank you, Julie. And there's already hands going up, so there will be a time for questions at the end. And Jason, you're on first with questions, but not quite yet. Vanessa, were you similar to Julie, or were there differences?
Yes.
And what resonated?
I had to smile actually through all of like what Julie just said, but what really, really resonated with me there was how after sort of long exposure, you can sort of get stuck in the state. And that really makes sense sort of when I think back to how my life was going prior to this. So I'm the opposite of Julie. I lived my life full on. I thought that constantly being stressed, constantly being busy, high performing was normal, and that's how you are successful. So that was sort of something I lived by. So I thought it was normal. And when I think back right to the period before I got COVID, so it was actually quite unfortunate. COVID has hit my family quite hard. So while I was being infected, I had two family members, my mother and my grandmother, both in ICU with COVID. My mother recovered. My grandmother unfortunately passed away from it. And all of this happened while I was sitting on my own in my flat, not being allowed to say goodbye to my grandmother, not being allowed to be with my loved ones. So that obviously added a huge amount of stress to myself. And sort of the year leading up to this, I was working out excessively, 6 days a week, 3 hours a day, on very minimal rest, on very minimal calories. So I actually, the year before, I already started seeing sort of symptoms. So my body was like talking to me before it started shouting. So I feel like COVID was sort of that last, to the tip of the iceberg that made everything overflow. So it makes sense. And I always like to bring in here, I have a history of childhood trauma. And this is actually something in itself that constantly keeps the stress response on if it is not addressed.
Vanessa and Julie, thank you so much for sharing. And Maria, I'm going to go to you actually and ask you to kind of link up what Anna's talking about, but also try and link up what Julie and Vanessa have talked about. And I know that you have been responsible for helping hundreds of people as a doctor, but also a researcher as well. Can you tell us a bit in terms of what's going on and how we help people, or how you help people, Maria?
Oh, thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you so much for having me here to talk about treatment for this patient group. As you said, I have a lot of both clinical and research experience with this group. And recently I've been involved in 2 different RCTs, research projects, where we are checking out different therapies for adults with long COVID. And first off, I just want to say, Vanessa and Julie, huge thanks to you guys for being here and sharing your stories, and Rachel as well. I know you're open with sharing your stories and how you have recovered, how bad it was, and then recovery. And this, I think it's so important for other patients to hear this, but also for other clinicians to hear this. And it's not easy, because this field of medicine is kind of a weird field, because patients who have recovered and tell their recovery stories, they actually get quite much harassment. And also researchers and clinicians who talk about effective treatments for this patient group can get scoffed at and bullied. Yet the research have been quite clear for many years now what works within this group. And we know that cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and also different kinds of exposure therapies work for this patient group. And with exposure therapy, I'm talking about therapies where patients gradually do things they have stopped doing due to their symptoms, but with the therapeutic help and a different kind of understanding of what's going on, then they don't experience the symptoms the same way. So why the controversy? Why is this so hard for the world to understand? And I think it's a huge problem within Western medicine, how we understand the body. Western medicine is clearly divided between physical and mental in our healthcare system. And we don't actually haven't been aware of how our bodies work. And as Anna was so neatly talking about, how all the different bodily systems are integrated and connected. And our brain is not a separate thing away apart from the body. It's so integrated. So what I feel when I meet patients, and what's important also in research, is you have to understand, or you don't have to understand, but have a different view of your symptoms. So actually, before I talk about the treatment, I would like to talk about what is all these symptoms. Like Vanessa and Julie talked about, they've been so sick, they have never been so sick before, and what's going on. And no matter how we view it, we can't get through that symptoms occur when certain areas in the brain are activated. So if we put any patients in a brain scanner and induce pain, physical pain, you can see certain areas of the brain light up. And then if we induce pain by hypnosis or even make them visualize pain, it's the same areas of the brain that lights up. So to feel symptoms, you have to have some brain activity. Actually, symptoms is a brain function. So the areas that light up when you feel these sickness, behavior symptoms, pain, fatigue, are areas that overlap with these areas that also govern the stress system, like Anna was talking about, and are also working on what's important, what's happening inside the body, and what's important to be aware of, and how could we stay healthy and alive. These circuits within the brain could obviously be activated by tissue damage, but it could also be something different. Like in the fMRI scanner, you could have a physical pain stimuli that activate the pain areas, but you could also just be thinking about pain and then feeling pain. And what we know about acute symptoms are quite well correlated with what's happening with your body. Chronic symptoms are quite way off. So how about all these physiological changes? Vanessa, Julie, Rachel, all you guys were talking about, all these physiological changes. Well, we know that patients that experience chronic symptoms like chronic fatigue, chronic pain, they have a slight increase in the sympathetic nerve system, the stress nerve system. They have a slight decrease in the parasympathetic nervous system, and it was like yin yang, like Anna was talking about. They also have a slight immune activation, and also the HPA axis is not working there. It's not as flexible as in a normal person. So it's a bit off. And in extreme cases, you see POTS, like Vanessa and Julie talked about, and you see MCAS, POTS being postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, where you get a really high heart rate just from standing up, and MCAS being mast cell activation syndrome, where the mast cells within the immune system activate really easily. And what could you do to treat? Because here we come into treatment, and you could give medication to treat the mast cell activation, to reduce the mast cell activation, and you could also give medication to reduce the heart rate. However, if you give this medication, maybe the heart rate goes down a bit, but the patient generally don't feel any better. And what Anna gave us a short, brilliant lecture on is because all of these systems interacting, and all the symptom load is still activated, even though you have changed the physiology a slight bit. But what we do see, if we treat the symptoms, then the physiology seems to normalize. So it seems really important to do something with the symptom activation within the brain. So how could we get rid of the symptoms? Well, as we talked about, we know that cognitive behavioral therapy helps, and also exposure therapies. And for the last 10-15 years, it's been a true development within neuroscience, understanding how the brain works and the bodily systems works in a predictive manner, and how they cooperate and work together. So the recent years, it's been coming more and more mind-body therapies or brain training therapies. And for all of these therapies, what's consistent? For all therapies, the patients get a different explanation for the symptoms. Rachel, you mentioned that you were really scared of your blue toes, but when you understood, okay, my physiology is slightly off, but that's not dangerous, and the symptoms itself is not dangerous. When you understand that, then you will go into the therapy with a different mindset, and you can have different kind of experience. So that's the same across all of these therapies. And if we focus more on each therapy form, the cognitive behavioral therapies, they are working on how thoughts influence the symptoms, how you feel, what you think about, how you think about the situation influences how you feel and how you behave. So both work on the thoughts and not going into avoidance behavior. With the exposure therapies, you are kind of not talking so much about your thoughts, but just go straight ahead to do the work. You are gradually making, I suppose, starting at the safe level for the patient, and then just gradually building on that. With a new kind of understanding of symptoms, then you will feel more safe and have a different experience. Again, it's key with a different kind of experience. And the newer mind-body therapies, they work much more on symptom perception. How could we change and manipulate how we actually feel symptoms? How does the brain work? Because as both Vanessa and Julie were talking about, an activated, stressed brain, you don't have to feel like, oh, I'm super stressed. You could just be really activated, like having a full life, like Vanessa was talking about. It was an activated brain produces more symptoms. That state of mind produces easier symptoms than a calm state of mind. So then you're working on different kinds of ways to change your symptom perception. And I do think it's not so much research on what therapies work for different kind of patients, but I see patients, some patients come to me and they are afraid to do anything, have massive avoidance behavior. And then you could easily go on to addressing that, and with a secure environment, try to do some things with a new experience. But also I have patients that are, okay, I'm not doing the avoidance behavior. I push through. I'm going to do this. No matter how much symptoms I got. And then you're not helping, because if you understand how the brain works and would learn to associate symptoms with everything you do, and if you just push through and still experience the symptom, you would just manifest the symptom even more. So for those, I think the newer mind-body therapies maybe working even better.
Maria, thank you very much. That was fascinating, and you're getting some claps already. Lots of claps, actually. I'm going to go to Vanessa first, actually, and just Vanessa, I'm really interested to find out what resonated from what Maria said, and more importantly, how did you use some of the things that Maria said for your own recovery?
Actually, everything she said resonated, because that was pretty much how I had recovered. Once I sort of got on board with the brain science, understood the brain science, there was sort of a first, oh my God, I can actually recover. So that seed was planted in my head that I will listen to those people that have recovered and not the people who haven't. So that was sort of my first step. What I personally then did was I got a therapist, but for me it was really important to get someone that was trained in this approach, because I had therapists before, and I didn't quite get on board with how the therapy went in that sense. So it was a lot better for me to get someone who was sort of trained in that neuroplastic approach. And we sort of unraveled all these avoidance behaviors. I had lots of them. I had almost OCD-like behavior about certain things. Like, for example, my sleep at night, I had to have a whole 2-hour routine, because I was so scared if I wasn't going to do it that I wouldn't be able to sleep. I was extremely strict with my diet. I was not driving my car. I was scared to do anything. Like, life became something that had to be tightly managed, and 99% of things I was afraid to do, and that wasn't really me, but that sort of was like what had happened after like years of being sick and being afraid and reading horror stories online. Then I left all sort of groups on Reddit, on Facebook, on Instagram, anything that didn't have anything to do with positive recovery. And for me, then it was sort of teaching my nervous system that it is safe. Yeah. So it was more sort of how did I react when symptoms arose? So instead of freaking out, I actually talked to my brain. I was like, okay, brain, it's okay. It's not actually dangerous. I called my symptoms Bob sometimes and just said, okay, Bob, not today. I'm not doing this today. And I just went on and did something else. So in that sense, finding joy again and doing lots and lots of things that have nothing to do with my illness. And for I hinted on it earlier, so I had a bit of unresolved trauma that I had never addressed in my life. So I actually went to trauma therapy. I'm still going there. I'm still doing that, and that sort of lowered my overall like stress reservoir. Think of it like a cup that constantly kept overflowing. And I started putting the ladle in and lowering the reservoir. So yeah, and I think lastly, what I would say is build a toolbox of things that like de-stress you. That's very, very individual, but for me it was meditation, some yoga. I like to do tapping, these sort of things, anything that sort of like could calm me down in the moment, and then work with that. And over time, it got better and better and better.
Vanessa, that's amazing. I love the analogy, Bob. I'm going to use that for sure. Julie, was your recovery similar, or
Yeah, there was a lot of similarity. I think for me also, the very first part of it was having that understanding. And I think it was Maria that talked about the sort of big steps that neuroscience have been making recently. And I think it's certainly from what I'd come across, there was a lot of that around chronic pain, more probably than a lot of these other symptoms. But I think I just got to the point that I understood enough to realize it's the same mechanism. It doesn't really matter what my symptoms are, even though, so one of them was chest pain, like a heart attack. But in general, you know, it wasn't really about pain. It was just all these horrendous symptoms. So yeah, first of all, was really building that understanding. And that then allowed me to have faith that actually none of the stuff that I was experiencing was in itself dangerous. It was just a result of all this other stuff that was going on. And to have faith that recovery would be possible. And now that I understood why, I could sort of, that just kind of helped me keep hold of that. So I think, that was definitely the first step, is kind of building the understanding and the faith, and they kind of went hand in hand with each other. And then it was just working out, okay, so what do I do about this? So I practiced all the different tools around calming my nervous system down, trying to find what works for me, and just practicing them so much, kind of multiple times a day, without really building up activity at first, but just so that I had those available and that I'd be able to access them as and when I needed. And also just that process of kind of doing, you know, having these things as a daily routine kind of helped me to start to feel a little bit better. So I still, you know, I was certainly barely out of my bed before at this point, but I was starting to feel just a little bit better. Still had all of the symptoms, but they were perhaps just not quite as full on all of the time. And so even just these tiny little glimmers of improvement were enough to make me realize, okay, I'm on the right lines, just keep going. It's going to take as long as it takes. And then it was just a process of kind of testing all of this out gently at first. So just I kind of thought about it, you know, testing the waters, just trying to push the envelope just a tiny little bit, just to see if I could then use all the stuff that I've been learning, make it work for me, and you know, see that I could actually start to build up. And then as I got more confident, I could take bigger steps. And, you know, after a while, I mean, I was able to build up relatively quickly, but I didn't start like that. It was just sort of gently at first, building up the skills, the faith, all the tools that I needed, and just sort of that evidence as well. So, you know, as I was able to do a little bit more and use all these tools to help me respond more appropriately, that then gave me evidence that I could improve by doing this. And so then I could just, you know, continue to do that. So it was just a bit of a process. I quite liked how Vanessa had a name, Bob, that she would talk to. I kind of thought about it slightly differently, but I thought of my nervous system as a horse that just needed some help to understand that the world and the human environment it's expected to live in is not necessarily as scary as it might think, and to just sort of help it realize that, and, you know, work out, well, how can I help convince this horse? Because it's not just about telling it, you know, you can't just tell a horse, well, this isn't scary. It doesn't understand that. So you have to find ways to show it and to help it understand this for itself, and to be able to regulate itself. And so that, you know, that's what I was thinking of, and sort of thinking of my nervous system as this horse that I was helping. I was becoming its trusted leader, so it knew that it could have some faith in me, but also, you know, I had to really show it that this is all okay, and sort of build up gradually in a way that it was able to come along with me, and it wasn't kind of over facing the horse, essentially. So yeah, that's the way I approached it.
Julie, thank you. And I do remember actually you sending me a picture of you one of your first thoughts in terms of exposure was just sitting on the horse, not even riding it, but just sitting and seeing that picture and knowing that you were then on the route to recovery. So thank you again, Maria, that was brilliant, and Vanessa and Julie. And I think it's now time and I think Jason had his hand up from about 20 minutes in. So I don't know if Jason is here, but then I think we've got time for probably about 5 questions. But if I can start with Jason, who's not even probably on the screen now. Where's Jason?
I am still here. I had to transfer to the phone. I had to drive. I'm just pulling over for a second, though. Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely. We don't want you getting any speeding tickets or anything like that on our behalf.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed the talks. It's just very inspiring. But one thing I was curious about is there the ability for any of the individuals that have now successfully achieved recovery to describe what it was that allowed them to pursue these mind-body approaches when that seems to be resisted sometimes because the message seems to be whether you call it gaslighting, whether you call it stigmatizing, how was it that they were able to sort of approach these techniques that then allowed them to recover?
Julie, you've come off mute, so I'm going to assume.
Yeah. I think for me it was a combination. So it was starting to pay attention to people who had recovered and what had helped them, rather than just focusing on the people who were as ill as me. Because I started off with a symptom by symptom approach, and if somebody had recovered but they didn't have all the same symptoms as me, then well, it's not relevant, and that doesn't mean that I can recover. I stopped doing that and just started looking for patterns. So all of these people have recovered. What's the common themes? And one of the things that came out of that was that most of them had followed something like a mind-body approach. Variations on that, some kind of had that as a bigger part of their recovery, but it seemed to be something that was in there for most of the people that I sort of followed that had recovered and were saying, I fully recovered and this is how I did it. So I guess that didn't convince me in itself, but that kind of gave me a little teaser and a little hook that made me think, well, what is this mind-body approach? What does that mean? Why is that helping them recover? And that's when I then started trying to look up some of the sort of science aspects of it. And I came across quite a lot of work around the brain's role in chronic pain and how that is then used to help people recover from chronic pain. And once I'd started down that route, then that's when it all came together. So it just suddenly started to make a lot of sense that, this explains why, although it's very real physical symptoms, the brain has a role and there are things you can do about it to convince your brain that it doesn't need to respond in that way. So I think it was the kind of people like Rachel, Rachel was one of those people. And because she was so vocal about it, it was great, because even if I ignored her the first time, I'd come across something else. And when I was ready to hear it, I could then start paying more attention to why Rachel had recovered and what had helped her. And so, yeah, it was kind of those two together. Just, it got to a point where I suddenly thought, aha, this all makes sense now. This is very real and I can do something about this. Let's work out how it's going to work for me.
Thank you, Julie. I do remember a message where you said, to begin with, I was really insulted, Rachel. And then eventually you shouted loud enough. And I think you also quoted Fiona Symington, who I know is in the audience as well. I'm going to go to Michele and see Michelle's question, just from a time perspective, really, to try and get in as many questions as possible. Michele, you're on mute, though. Can we unmute Michele? She's got a hand up. No, okay. Yes,
can you hear
brilliant.
me?
Michele,
Okay.
yes.
Sorry. I just kind of wanted to broach a question that I think, was important in my recovery. A lot of the illness groups that are focused less on recovery and more on the illness, hang their hat on this ATP theory and mitochondria dysfunction. And I found that was, I kind of wanted to ask the experts, what their thought is, because my issue was that actually held me back in recovery. If I had symptoms, then I thought it was an ATP issue. And so I had to wait 3 days and just symptoms ramped up. Once I let go of that and toss that theory out the window, because when the body shuts down, it's shutting down all systems. So why are we focused on that? And I think it's more harmful. So I just kind of wanted to, that's my, an expert idea that helped me, but I'm wondering what the experts think about that.
And I'm wondering, Maria or Anna, can either of you speak about that?
And I just did want to add to Jason's question was, I went the Western medical route for so many years and finally had to go to MindBody. So that's what convinced me.
Thank you, Michele. Can we just clarify the question and see whether we can get an answer? So, Michele, can you just give us the question again?
How important is it to focus on, in CFS and long COVID, on mitochondria dysfunction or ATP issues?
I would say it's not. Maria?
No, I think it's totally the wrong focus. And we could see some changes within the energy metabolism, but as Anna has described, all these symptoms are so much connected, and if you have a slight sympathetic activation, you wouldn't get the same as Anna described, the rest and digest. So it's not, even though if you could see a slight rise in lactate, or it's just part of this imbalance, and it's not mitochondrial dysfunction or disease itself. It's just yet another slight physiological sign of how these systems are a bit out of whack.
Thank you, Maria. And I mean, my degree was in biochemistry, so I absolutely wrapped myself in knots trying to remember the Krebs cycle and all these things that I thought I'd forgotten from 30 years ago. And it didn't help at all. In fact, the more I learned, the worse I got. And then when I looked upstream and I looked in terms of the nervous system, everything got better. So I think that would be my answer, Michele, from a patient perspective. Do we have one more question before we wrap up? Do we have one more question? I've got one lined up otherwise, but it'd be nice to get one more from the audience. Jane.
Sorry. Hi, Rachel.
Hi.
It's not a question, actually. I'm just going to say, I don't know how many people on the call aren't recovered, but I had chronic pain. We know that the long COVID and chronic fatigue syndrome, it's all, coming from the same brain, but I had it for 37 years. And within 4 months of getting on the MindBody path, I was on my way to recovery. So I want people to know it's never too long. It doesn't matter, it's never too late. Doesn't matter how long you've had the symptoms. Doesn't matter how old you are. This is incredible. I mean, what we can recover from, chronic pain plus about 20 other symptoms, always treated medically. And I discovered the MindBody on my own. But I'm just here to say, keep going. Don't give up. There's answers out there for everybody. Once the seed is planted and we know that these modalities are available, it's incredible.
Jane, thank you. And I saw the reaction of people's faces as well. So I hope when you watch it back, you see the impact that story has had. Vanessa, I'm going to go Vanessa and then Paul and then wrap up.
I just
Vanessa.
wanted to sort of chip in here what Jane just said. When I get so my story is public out there on a forum. So ever since I've gotten quite a lot of questions from people, and one of the predominant questions I get is, how long did it take you? And for anyone who isn't recovered, I just want to encourage you to not put a timeline on it, because everyone's recovery looks different. So I consider myself recovered because I don't have any more sort of issues that limit my life. But I do still have a bit of a sensitive nervous system. And I've been working on this stuff now for 1.5 years. And sometimes I've seen very steep, rates of recovery followed by sort of little dips and up. It's like an up and down path. So please don't compare your case to someone else, and just keep going. And actually the days when it feels really hard and we have little flares, that is our moment where we can really make a dent in this recovery because of how we will respond to this.
Thank you, Vanessa. And I want to add that me and Vanessa actually met about 4 years ago on a brain retraining program. And it's fair to say that I had better outcomes from that program than Vanessa at the time. But then we met 3.5 years later, and Vanessa had then found her path by listening to somebody else. And I'd actually listened to them first. And so, you know, you just it has to be the right time, I think, and the right person. And sometimes you have to hear the same thing multiple times in different ways, but it is worth pursuing. So I was so happy when I then met Vanessa again, and heard the rest of your story. Paul, I know you had your hand up.
Yes, intellectually understanding the mind-body interaction is quite easy to get to understand. But what these stories really pushed home to me was the degree to which you sort of experienced the mind-body connection and how you started dealing with it and managing it and the hard work that you put into to getting better. So it isn't just a question. You see a lot of Facebook pages where they say, oh, well, I'll do this course and then that will fix it. But it's the understanding then you need to work with it to experience the mind-body connection and then help work out how you influence it. Very strong in your stories. I thought they were very good. Thank you for sharing them.
And thank you to everyone. And I think with about 2 minutes to spare, I'm going to wrap up and just say to everyone, thank you so much for coming. I genuinely, this is the third one I've done, and I just think it's so powerful, and everyone is so powerful to have, you know, the scientists and the researchers and the doctors and the therapists and the recovered patients all in one room. Just to remind you, we've been talking on behalf of COFFI, and you can look at COFFI and some of the COFFI research on their website. You will get a recording sent to you of this video, so do share it far and wide if you found it helpful, or if you can think of who might have found it helpful. Joel's putting up a poll. Can I just say thank you to Joel for organising this. He's also a researcher in his own right, so doing this kind of to help us out. So he's putting up a poll, so that'd be brilliant. We're going to put the recording on the same channel that we've also got the previous seminar around post-exertional malaise, so you'll be able to watch that as well. One of the trials that Maria talked about, the Norwegian outplacement project, that will also be on the same channel so that you can see that. I'm pretty easy to find. There's a group of us on here that are pretty easy to find. So if you do have questions, then feel free to continue this discussion after this seminar, and we'll attempt to get you answers if we can't answer them ourselves. And that is everything from me. Thank you.